Albert Einstein. Do you know what they found in Einstein's brain? And who stole the brain upon Einstein's death? The location of his brain remained a mystery for years. All of the answers you will find it in Do You Know? During his life, Albert Einstein made some of the world's greatest scientific discoveries. However, the location of his brain, which was controversially removed by the pathologist Dr. Thomas Harvey upon Einstein's death in 1955, remained a mystery for years. Before we jump into what happened, click on that red subscribe button to be up to date with all the latest content. At 1:15 in the morning of 18 April 1955, Albert Einstein mumbled a few words in German, took 2 breaths, and died. Many scientists have tried to figure out what made him so smart. But no one tried harder than a pathologist named Thomas Harvey, who lost his job and his reputation in a quest to unlock the secrets of Einstein's genius. Harvey never found the answer. But through an unlikely sequence of events, his search helped transform our understanding of how the brain works. In the name of science, how that happened is a strange story that involves a dead genius, a stolen brain, a rogue scientist, and a crazy idea that turned out not to be so crazy. The genius, Einstein, died April 18, 1955, at Princeton Hospital in Princeton, New Jersey. Within hours, the quiet town was swarming with reporters and scientific luminaries, and people who simply wanted to be near the great man one last time. It was like the death of the prophet, and so it got a little bit crazy. Things got especially crazy for Thomas Harvey, who performed the autopsy on Einstein. During the procedure, he removed the brain to examine it, which is routine. But instead of placing the brain back in the skull, Harvey put it in a jar of formaldehyde. And out of that complete, sort of melee of the moment, he made off with the brain, and it was under somewhat dubious circumstances. Harvey later said Einstein's older son Hans Albert had given him permission to take the brain. But the Einstein family denied this. In any event, Harvey lost his job and was denounced by many colleagues. But he kept the brain. His justification was a sense of duty to science. After the removal of the brain, Dr. Harvey cut it into 240 fine sections and embedded it in celadon and took tissue samples from each block, mounted them onto microscope slides, and distributed the slides to some of the world's best neuropathologists. He believed that his role was to preserve this brain and to put it in the hands of some leading neuroanatomists who might be able to figure out the key to Einstein's genius. It was found that Einstein's brain weighed only 1,230 grams, less than the average adult brain, which weighs about 1,400 grams. However, the density of neurons was greater. Dr. Lithgow said, "Normally the parietal cortex is divided by a deep groove, but as was absent in Einstein's brain, merging 2 remote regions and increasing connectivity in this area. Recent studies have linked this area with mathematical skills and those around it with the pseudospatial processing, and now we know that this anatomical feature makes sense." So studies of Einstein's brain began, although the first detailed one didn't appear for 30 more years. In 1985, a study revealed that 2 parts of Einstein's brain contained an unusually large number of non-neuronal cells called glia for every neuron or nerve-transmitting cell in the brain. 10 years after that, Einstein's brain was found to lack a furrow normally seen in the parietal lobe. Scientists at that time said the missing furrow might have been related to Einstein's enhanced ability to think in 3 dimensions, as well as to his mathematical skills. It showed that Einstein's brain had an unusually complex pattern of convolutions in the prefrontal cortex, which is important for abstract thinking. In other words, Einstein's brain actually looks different from yours or mine. Einstein had extraordinary prefrontal cortices right behind the forehead, which revealed an intricate pattern of convolutions. Years passed, however, and no scientific paper emerged. After a while, Einstein's brain was forgotten. In 1996, Britt Anderson at the University of Alabama at Birmingham published a study on Einstein's prefrontal cortex. He found that the number of neurons was equivalent to brains in a control group, but they were more tightly packed, allowing, perhaps, for faster processing of information. Perhaps the most striking is that Einstein had an extra ridge on his mid-frontal lobe, the part used for making plans and working memory. Most people have 3 ridges, but Einstein had 4. She also found Einstein's parietal lobes were dramatically asymmetric, and he had a knob on his right motor strip. This latter feature is called the sign of omega, and it is thought to be correlated to musicians who use their left hands.
Dabbling in theoretical physics on the side. That's when he had what he called the happiest thought of his life.
On the road with Einstein's brain, paternity caught up with Harvey 40 years later, when the writer became intrigued by the story of Einstein's brain. Over the phone, the men hatched a plan to return the brain to Einstein's granddaughter Evelyn, who was living in Berkeley. By that time, Harvey was in his 80s and living alone just a few miles from Princeton. Paternity drove down from his home in Maine in a rented Buick Skylark.
An unknown pathologist who, after opening up Einstein's skull, reached in and removed perhaps the greatest mind of modern times.
When he arrived, Harvey was ready to go. He brought out his bags, and in one bag he had a Tupperware container in which he had stashed the brain. They put everything in the trunk and started driving west. Paternity describes the trip in his book Driving Mr. Albert. A trip across America with Einstein's brain. The book includes some mind-blowing weirdness, including a stop in Lawrence, Kansas, to visit Harvey's former neighbor.
If there was any gross, unusual feature, but I didn't see any.
Along the way, Harvey told Paternity how he had tried to fulfill his duty to science by periodically sending bits of Einstein's brain to various neuroscientists. So, he didn't have the entire brain, and much of it was sliced up.
It followed from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are but different manifestations of the same thing. A somewhat unfamiliar conception for the average mind.